So I think it's pretty obvious for those of you that are paying attention and for those of you that watch this channel that Governor Ron DeSantis is definitely gearing up for a run at the Republican nomination in 2024. Now, I made a video sometime back talking about this, that Ron DeSantis was basically unofficially running, and now this article out of NBC sort of reinforces that notion that DeSantis really is planning a run behind the scenes. Obviously, he's kept a lot of things hush-hush, but in this story, there's a couple of disclosures from people around DeSantis sort of outlining the strategy that the governor plans to take to the Republican nomination. So we're going to take a look at what Ron DeSantis' strategy is and whether or not it's an intelligent and viable strategy. And ultimately, we'll take a brief look at where we are right now in the 2024 GOP primary. Now, I'm disproportionately making videos on the Republican primary mainly because there's nothing really going on the Democratic side. You've got Robert Kennedy Jr. running against Joe Biden. He's going to get a total maybe 4% of the vote. That's not a competitive primary. If Joe Biden is officially running, and I think that was the story that came out either today or yesterday, then it's not going to be a contested primary. Marianne Williamson, none of these Democrats are going to get anywhere close to President Biden. He's going to cruise to the nomination easily and advance to the general election virtually without a problem. The Republican side, however, is going to be a bit different. So we're going to take a deep dive into this in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe to the channel down below and leave a thumbs up if you enjoy. Remember to share this video with your friends. So anyway, Ron DeSantis' strategy is quite simple. It's basically to play the long game, and DeSantis is in it for the long haul. And I think what he means by this strategy, and as the article goes on, I'll leave a link to it down in the description below, but essentially DeSantis and his team will be targeting more delegate-heavy states. So they're not really focusing as much on places like Iowa and New Hampshire. I think they're counting on Trump to sort of potentially win those primaries, but they're trying to play the long game, putting more investments in big primary states like New York, like Florida, like California, Texas, Pennsylvania, Illinois, states with a lot more delegates. And some of these states are winner-take-all states, meaning that if Ron DeSantis, for instance, gets a certain percentage of the vote, in some of these states, if you get over 50%, it's winner-take-all. In some states, if you just get the plurality, it's winner-take-all. So I'm not going to go into the rules with every single primary state. That'll be for a different video at a different time. But essentially, DeSantis' strategy is not to go into the primary with a huge splash in Iowa, Nevada, New Hampshire, but to sort of do well in those states, but then kind of play the long game, get his campaign infrastructure in bigger primary states, and ultimately make a much bigger impact in the primary and end up getting the nomination through delegates and securing delegates in those states, especially the winner-take-all states. So again, it's not surprising that DeSantis is doing this. He's been traveling to a lot of these states. He's traveled to Nevada, Iowa, New Hampshire. So he's been going to these states that are pretty important for him to win in the primary. But again, it's still very early. It's only mid-April at this point. DeSantis isn't even running officially. He's not a declared candidate. He hasn't announced, but it's very clear what DeSantis is doing in all of this. Now, this article goes on to state what I've said many times on this channel, that DeSantis isn't expected to formally declare his candidacy until May or June. But he's not going to skip the first contest, meaning he's not going to skip Iowa, New Hampshire, these other states. Now, other candidates in different primaries have tried this strategy. I believe Michael Bloomberg in the Democratic primary tried to basically bypass the early states since he jumped in a little later and sort of invest his campaign infrastructure in later states, and it was disastrous. It didn't really work out because when you win these early contests, it gives your campaign a lot of momentum. And if DeSantis were to win Iowa, for instance, if he were to win Nevada, it would give his campaign a huge amount of momentum. Now, interestingly enough, in the Republican primary, winning Iowa doesn't always mean you win the nomination. Ted Cruz won Iowa back in 2016 and 2012. I think it was Mike Huckabee won Iowa, and then or maybe Rick Santorum. I'm getting my elections confused. I think 2008 might have been Mike Huckabee. I've got to brush up on some of my Republican primary history, but regardless, Iowa is not known to pick the Republican nominee in GOP primaries. So honestly, if DeSantis does win Iowa, that's probably good news for Trump from a historical perspective. Now, again, history isn't always doomed to repeat, but DeSantis really is putting a lot of his resources in California, New York, Georgia, Pennsylvania. I think some of these states he's more favored than others. I mean, looking at this map right now, I think Virginia is going to be a good state for somebody like DeSantis. Obviously, Florida. I think Georgia as well. Potentially Texas, Nevada. So there's a number of states on the map that I think he's got a much bigger advantage in. Obviously, I think Trump probably has a big advantage in some of the Rust Belt states. New York, my home state, might be the most interesting in the primary because while it is Donald Trump's former home state, it's also a state with a large Italian Catholic population that I think would definitely be more swayed by somebody like DeSantis this time around, since he is an Italian Catholic. And I think identity still plays a role in primaries even to this day in 2024. But going on into the rest of this, essentially, DeSantis has been making some new hires. Obviously, he's got new super PACs, Never Back Down. The Draft Ron DeSantis, I think, which was an Ed Rollins group. So he's got a number of big groups sort of putting this infrastructure together sort of behind the scenes while DeSantis still continues to govern the state of Florida and still continues to kind of keep a pretty low profile. I mean, Donald Trump has tried to put DeSantis in the spotlight. I think something Donald Trump is doing correctly is that he's trying to define DeSantis earlier as, you know, establishment or the same old. They're saying he's going to cut Social Security. Very much running to the left of DeSantis in the primary, sort of trying to court those Obama-Trump voters that he won in the general. But that's an interesting strategy to play in a Republican primary when a lot of those voters might not even be registered Republicans. They're probably independents, or even some might be still registered Democrats. But regardless, I certainly think not focusing a lot on the early states is a bit of a mistake, especially because those tend to catapult somebody towards the nomination. I mean, losing Iowa is not the end of the world, but if you're losing New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, usually your candidacy is done. Now, of course, we got a lot of other people jumping into the race. Of course, Nikki Haley is already in the race. Tim Scott is expected to run. Asa Hutchinson apparently is running. So you've got a number of other Republicans, most of which don't have a viable path to the nomination. But their impact is more so how long they stay in the race, not if they win the nomination, because Donald Trump benefits from a very divided Republican field. We saw this back in 2016. And again, I'm very hesitant to use 2016 primary results to sort of look at 2024 primary results because 2016 and 2024 are very, very different political environments, both in the primary and in the general. So I think a lot of people comparing 2024 to 2016 are making a fatal mistake in their analysis because this election is going to be very different than the 2016 election. It's going to focus on very different issues. And Donald Trump is not a new commodity in 2024. He's been sort of the center of attention for the political news media since 2015. So 8 years we've had Donald Trump sort of in the spotlight. So this isn't some, untested candidate. Trump has, been tried before by the Republican electorate. And the 2024 primary is essentially going to be, do we want to go with Donald Trump a third time? And that's really going to be the big question of the primary. But again, looking at some of these early contests, again, you had Cruz win Iowa, Trump won New Hampshire, Trump won South Carolina, Trump won Nevada, so on and so forth. Cruz really wasn't able to stand a chance against Trump, and that's mainly because when you look at a lot of the states, Trump was getting pluralities of the vote. If you look at New Hampshire, for instance, 35% of the vote, that's a little bit over a third of the vote, but because you've got so many candidates splitting up the field, it totally tanked the rest of their chances to try and stop Trump from getting the nomination because a lot of these candidates did not want Trump to be the nominee. Most Republicans didn't want Trump to be the nominee early on. As the primary went on, he grew on a lot of Republicans. But, I mean, looking at just some of these early states real quick, Trump is getting less than a third of the vote in a lot of these states. And yet these candidates still stayed in the race and ultimately gave Trump a massive edge in the primary. They gave the nomination to him on a silver platter at the end of the day because they all stayed in the race. And that's something Trump is counting on this time around to try and stop Ron DeSantis, because let's not kid ourselves. The nominee for the Republican Party as of now is either going to be Trump or DeSantis. I don't think anybody else really stands a realistic chance. Nikki Haley's got a 0.2% chance. Tim Scott's probably got a 0% chance. Asa Hutchinson is not going to be the Republican nominee. None of these other candidates really are going to be it. It's either going to be Trump or DeSantis. So I think it is a bit foolish for a lot of these candidates to jump in now. And I think donors are sort of signaling that. A lot of the donors really aren't backing Haley or Tim Scott. they're really getting behind Trump or DeSantis because they know one of them is going to be the nominee. They're not going to waste their money on Asa Hutchinson or some other candidate that's polling at 1% now and really isn't going to go anywhere as the primary goes on. So looking at DeSantis' strategy, I don't think it's necessarily the best one he could go with, especially since he really needs to make a splash in these early primary states to actually have a chance against Donald Trump with the nomination. I mean, if we take a look at some of the opinion polls now, and again, I stress that opinion polls don't really mean a whole lot this early on, but Trump is dominating the primary field. He's at 52% in the RCP average. That's over half. I remember at a lot of these earlier polls, Trump was polling below 50%. He certainly was a lot more vulnerable, but he's gotten a pretty significant bump since the indictment. That's probably going to linger around for another month or so, but I don't expect it to stand. That doesn't mean Trump's not going to be the nominee, but I think he's going to fall back down in the polls as time goes on, especially given the fact that there's going to be other candidates in the race, other things are going to happen, and we've still got a long primary to go. But with that being said, Trump is obviously still the favorite to be the Republican nominee, but this is definitely going to be a much more competitive horse race than it was back in 2020 when Trump was virtually unopposed. The other candidates had no chance whatsoever. This time we've got an actual open competitive primary, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the Republican electorate votes this time around, because 2016 was 8 years ago by the time of 2024 voting. So you're going to have new Republican voters in the fold, and it's going to be interesting to see how they assess these candidates. But anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.